Okay, welcome. Tonight we're going to be talking about the reproductive system. And the reproductive system, let me enlarge my slides here. It's a series of organs and glands that reproduce and mature sex cells. And by sex cells, for males, we're talking sperm, and for females, we're talking eggs or oocytes. And then, in addition to the sex cells, we also have a series of organs that contributes to fertilization. And fertilization is referring to when the sperm and egg unite. Sex cells have one set of genetic instructions carried on 23 chromosomes. In other words, each sex cell has half the genetic material. So the sex cells have to unite or become fertilized in order for 46, or the full set of chromosomes, to be present. Okay, again, humans have 46 chromosomes, and their sex cells have 23. Sex cells are produced by another type of division called meiosis. And let's look at the next slide here, and let me demonstrate this a little better. So here, male and female, you're what are called 2N, that's diploid, meaning that you have, let's spotlight this, meaning that you have a whole 46 chromosomes. So males and females have 46 chromosomes. What meiosis is the product of cell division in which the female either creates an egg and the male creates a sperm. And they are 1N, and N is haploid, meaning they are 23. So the egg and the sperm come together at fertilization and create a zygote, which could possibly lead to a new human, and that human is 2N, so that human has 46 chromosomes. Okay, meiosis, the reason why meiosis produces gametes, sperm or egg, which is another term for gamete, is because meiosis undergoes two successive divisions. The first division is called meiosis 1, and then the second division is meiosis 2. In meiosis 1, the homologous chromosomes separate, and homologous is a new term for some of us. Actually, let me erase my drawings and use a spotlight here. Homologous is referring to the same gene for gene. So, for example, chromosome set 1, chromosome set 2, chromosome set 3. They may have some gene variants. We're going to talk about that in the next slide. But it results in haploid cells. In other words, in meiosis 1, the homologous pairs separate, and you are left with one set, and so therefore you have haploid cells. Now, there's still 46 chromosomes, so to get to the 23, you need to undergo meiosis 2, and that will separate the chromosomes into chromatids. This is the one that resembles mitosis. Anyway, after meiosis 2, the cells are still haploid, and they are now 4. So you go from 1 to 4. And let's get the spotlight back on. So meiosis, notice it has the same PMAT phases. Prophase is when the homologous pairs come together, and that's represented right here. So this particular organism has 4 chromosomes, so chromosome set 1 and chromosome set 2. Notice here that you have something called crossing over. Crossing over occurs when the homologous pairs switch or exchange identical genetic information. And what that results in is genetic variation. as you can see here, meiosis, or metaphase 1, which is also meiosis 1. Now in anaphase, they split, okay, the homologous pairs split, and then you have telophase. Again, even though there's 2 arms, there's still 46 chromosomes. These are haploid because you have split the pairs. You have split the homologous pairs. Now, meiosis 2 is the second division. Again, it has the PMAT phases. And here, the 2 cells both split, so the chromosomes will split into chromatids. And now you have 4 haploid cells. But the key here is that they are genetically different, or genetically variant. And this occurred because crossing over occurred in meiosis 1. Now we're going to talk about, well, very briefly, the parts. We'll start with the male reproductive system. And actually, I'm not planning to talk too much about that this evening. You have the primary sex organs, or the gonads. These are, in males, the testes, and they create the sperm cells. So the gonads are the part of the reproductive system that produces the cells, or gametes. You also have accessory sex organs, both internal and external, and this is the male reproductive system. I'll let you guys go through this one. Of course, you have the penis and the testes and the epididymis, and yes, okay, so I'll let you guys go through that. Okay. But what's important here, and we're going back to the testes here, is how sperm are made. And here, at the primary spermatocyte, this has 46 chromosomes. Okay. Then you'll undergo your first mitotic division. Again, these will be haploid chromosomes. They're called secondary spermatocytes. Then you'll get the second mitotic division, and you'll form what are called spermatids. These again are haploid, 23 chromosomes each, and these will mature into sperm cells. And for each time a primary spermatocyte divides, 4 sperm cells are made, and that's different in females, and we'll talk about that later. When we think about hormones and reproduction, primarily we think about females, but hormones play also a primary or pivotal role in male reproduction. And trying to find my mouse here. If you remember Chapter 13, you've got your primary players. You got the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland, as also in the testes. And these are going to produce hormones that are going to create the sperm cells and maintain the male sex characteristics. So let's meet our primary players here. First you have the hypothalamus. And before we get started here, these are all controlled by negative feedback loops. And remember, negative feedback is when the opposite of the initial stimulus occurs. So if you're making too much, say, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, negative feedback will tell you to make less. Okay, so the hypothalamus secretes GN, which is a gonadotropin-releasing hormone. And through the bloodstream, this is carried to the anterior pituitary gland, and it secretes the gonadotropins. And there are two primary gonadotropins. The first one's primarily luteinizing hormone, which is right here. Let me highlight that. Luteinizing hormone, or LH. And it is responsible for causing the testes to produce the male hormones. And the primary male hormone is testosterone. The other gonadotropin is follicle stimulating hormone. And it stimulates the maturation of the testes. And together, LH and follicle stimulating hormone, which is FSH, trigger spermatogenesis. And again, spermatogenesis is the creation of sperm. Now there are other male hormones, and again I'm looking for my cursor. Okay. Testosterone is the primary one, and male hormones are referred to as androgens. Let me spotlight that. Androgens. So here it says interstitial cells in the testes produce most of them. Interstitial cells are the cells around the cells that make the sperm. The most important male sex hormone is testosterone. And secretion of testosterone begins fetally and then stops, and then at puberty you get another spurt of testosterone if you're a male. What does testosterone do? Well, testosterone prior to birth, it helps the male reproductive organs develop, causes the descent of the testes into the scrotum. At puberty, you get the enlargement of the testes, which is the primary sex characteristic. And then you get the secondary sex characteristics, which is what we associate with maleness, body hair, facial hair, perhaps balding, deepening of the voice, increased muscle growth, strengthening and thickening of skeletal bones, and changes in skin. And what this chart is showing you is that it is all done via negative feedback. And again, hypothalamus releases gonadotropin releasing hormone, travels through the blood and stimulates the anterior pituitary to release the gonadotropins. That's follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone into the bloodstream. They travel to the testes, okay, and follicle stimulating hormone will stimulate spermatocytes to mature, whereas luteinizing hormone will cause luteinizing hormone to occur. And you have negative feedback by androgens, testosterone, causing, and we're up here, causing the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland to stop the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone, FSH and LH. Another hormone I didn't talk about was inhibin. Inhibin is also an androgen. Well, I'm sorry, it's also a sex hormone. And it kind of does what the name says. It inhibits. So it's going to inhibit both the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. You're also going to find inhibin in females. Okay, and speaking of the ladies, we have the organs of the female reproductive system. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but you have the female reproductive organs produce egg cells or oocytes. In addition, they also produce the female sex hormones, but also they have the favorable environment for the development of offspring, and this is referring to the uterus. The primary female sex organs, or the gonads, are the ovaries, And again, the ovaries produce the eggs, also gametes or oocytes. And the accessory female sex organs are both internal and external. And the next slide is a picture of these. And you have the usual players. Let me see. You have the ovaries, the uterus, the vagina. And again, I'll let you review these on your own. So let's talk about oogenesis. Oogenesis is the formation of the egg. And basically, oogenesis is meiosis. So you get primary oocytes, begin meiosis 1, resulting in half. And then the primary oocyte, when it divides, it forms a large secondary oocyte and a small polar body. And I'm going to show you a picture of that in a minute. And the secondary oocyte will undergo meiosis 2 after fertilization. And it also makes a secondary polar body. And if fertilization is successful, then you have a zygote. So let me show you a picture of that, and this is our next slide. What this is, here's your primary oocyte. It's got 46 chromosomes. It undergoes the first mitotic division, and you get a secondary oocyte, okay? And then you get what's called a polar body. You can think of what a polar body is just excessive, or kind of just a nucleus. It's just containing DNA. And this is going to get reabsorbed into the body. And this will also undergo a second mitotic division, but these will, as you can see, disintegrate. So polar bodies are kind of unused genetic material, if you will. The secondary oocyte is what's released, and if fertilization occurs, will undergo a second mitotic division. And here, when it undergoes a second mitotic division, it will produce a polar body, so it's getting rid of about half the genetic information. And you have a zygote, in which you have 46 chromosomes, 23 from the sperm and 23 from the egg. And should this implant, this will go on and form a new human. In addition to the egg, we want to talk about the follicles, or I wish to talk about the follicles. Every cycle, about 20 primary follicles begin maturing. So even though the female typically releases one egg at a time, many more begin to develop. And what the follicle is referring to, and let's go down here to our picture. The follicle is kind of talking about the tissue. So let's look at this one here, I'm sorry. Here's an egg here, okay, the oocyte, and then notice all this tissue around it. This tissue around it, around the egg, is called the follicle. And you have about 20 of these develop, and typically only one outgrows the other and is released, and it's called the dominant follicle. So the dominant follicle is what's released at ovulation. Okay. And here is ovulation, here. Okay. So again, notice you have a whole bunch of follicles that continue to grow, and the follicles, tissue, and the egg, and or the oocyte. After a while, the primary oocyte is released, which is shown in this one. And the primary oocyte will be taken in by the uterine tubes, or the fallopian tubes, same structure, and sent to the uterus. Now the tissue, the follicular tissue, will form a structure called the corpus luteum, and this is a very important hormone-secreting structure in female reproduction, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about female hormones. Which is right now. Again, you're going to see the same players in males almost. You're going to have hormones secreted by the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary gland, and again, in females, not only are the hormones signaling the growth of the oocytes, but we also have the secondary sex characteristics, and the organs the uterus in particular is getting ready to house a fertilized egg if fertilization should occur. So there's a little bit more going on in the female reproductive cycle, because not only does she have to produce a gamete or an oocyte, she also has to ready the uterus to house the fertilized egg should fertilization occur. Okay, so because of that, there are two cycles. There's the ovarian cycle, which is here, and the ovarian cycle is the events in the ovary, so it's the release of the oocytes. The uterine cycle, it's also known as the menstrual cycle. This is the changes that occur in the endometrium. The endometrium is the inner lining of the uterus. You can kind of think it loosely as the mucosal lining, if you will. So it is lining the lumen or the space in the uterus. Endometriosis is when the endometrium could potentially leave the uterus via the fallopian tubes and attach to other organs. But anyway, the endometrium is what changes during the uterine cycle because that is the nutritive tissue for the fertilized egg. So let's talk about the hormones here. We'll start, of course, with the hypothalamus and gonadotropin-releasing hormone. Okay, it's created by the hypothalamus, and it controls both cycles, the ovarian and the uterine. And it does this by causing the anterior pituitary gland to release our friend follicle-stimulating hormone, and now the term follicle makes a little more sense, and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. So follicle-stimulating hormone causes the follicle to grow, and it also causes the secretion of estrogen. Luteinizing hormone again, it's going to stimulate the follicles to secrete estrogen. It's going to stimulate, it's going to trigger ovulation. And again, that's the release of the egg. And luteinizing hormone is going to promote the formation of the corpus luteum. And again, the corpus luteum is what's left of the follicle after the oocyte's released. And the corpus luteum itself is going to produce estrogen and progesterone. These are the main female hormones, and relaxin and inhibin. And we'll talk about those in a moment. Okay. I lost my cursor here. Still lost. Here we go. Okay, so estrogen is secreted by the follicles, and estrogen itself, so it's secreted by the ovaries, gives the female reproductive structures, promotes the maintenance and development, gives us the secondary sex characteristics, such as a wider hips, breast. It does increase protein anabolism, or building, lower cholesterol, and it can inhibit release of gonadotropin hormone, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone. So again, here we're having negative feedback. Progesterone is secreted mainly by the corpus luteum. And not only is it going to prepare and maintain the endometrium, but it's going to get the mammary glands, or the breast, ready for milk production. And it too is going to inhibit gonadotropin releasing hormone and luteinizing hormone. So another example of negative feedback. And here, again, we have our hypothalamus secreting gonadotropin releasing hormone into the blood. It stimulates the pituitary gland to release the gonadotropins, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. They travel through the bloodstream, and they stimulate the ovaries to produce estrogens. Now, estrogen will come back in a negative feedback loop and inhibit the release of both gonadotropin releasing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. But once estrogen is in the bloodstream, then you're going to get all the secondary sex characteristics, such as hips and breast and other things. Okay, two more hormones we're going to talk about. One is relaxin. This is produced by the corpus luteum. And it inhibits the contraction of the myometrium. Myo is a prefix for muscle, so this is the muscular layer of the uterus. And at the end of pregnancy, it increases flexibility, particularly of the pubic symphysis, and it helps to dilate the cervix. This increasing the flexibility of the pubic symphysis, again, the baby's, well, not only the baby's head, but the shoulders also have to fit through the pelvic brim in order to exit the birth canal. So this is very important. And not only does it make the pubic symphysis more flexible, it also makes the rest of the joints in the female body more flexible. And then inhibin, again, it's secreted by the follicles and corpus luteum, and kind of does what the name says. It inhibits secretion of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Okay, so let's talk about how the hormones regulate the reproductive cycle of the female. And the reason why we're spending much more time on the reproductive cycle of females is not only because, well, one, they're cyclical. It's a monthly cycle, which is different from males. But also, we've got multiple organs that we're affecting. And male hormone release, there is some cyclicness to it, but it's mostly a normally occurring thing. Males produce sperm every day. Okay, so new term here, menses, which is, you may also know this as your period. This is menstrual bleeding, and what this is the release of the endometrium. Again, the endometrium is the inner lining of the uterus, and it grows back and dies off, or not dies off, but is lost. It grows and is lost in coordination with release of hormones. Begins around 13, or 10, 11, 12, and continues to your early 50s, and then you'll have menopause. And there are 4 phases of the female cycle. Okay. No female cycles vary from female to female, so that's not abnormal at all. But we're going to assume here 28 days for the sake of clarity. Again, this is a pretty broad range of days, and it does differ for each female. But the 4 phases are the menstrual phase, preovulatory phase, ovulation, and then the post-ovulatory phase. So let's talk about each of these phases. The menstrual phase or menstruation, again, it's roughly the first 5 days, and that's having your period. In other words, you are shedding your endometrium. So in the ovaries, you're going to see new primordial follicles develop. Okay? And in the uterus, you're going to see the menstrual discharge. In other words, your estrogen and progesterone levels are declining, and you're going to the endometrium is going to die off. The stratum basalis, there's 2 layers to the endometrium. You have the stratum basalis and the stratum functionalis. The basal layer, such as in the skin, is the one that's constantly reproducing, whereas the functional layer is the one that changes depending on the woman's cycle. The pre-ovulatory phase varies in length. So in a 28-day cycle, let's say it's the next week's 6 to 13 days, some secondary follicles begin to secrete estrogen, but now you start to get a dominant follicle, and it's going to start to release inhibin, which will decrease follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. You may have fraternal twins result when 2 eggs are released in the same cycle. This could occur because 2 or 3 follicles become codominant. Okay, so once one follicle becomes dominant, it's also called the Graafian follicle. So one will become dominant, and then in the uterus, the estrogens will start to repair the endometrium. In other words, the stratum basalis undergoes mitosis, and you get forms a new stratum functionalis, and this will double the thickness of the endometrium. Again, remember, stratum basalis and stratum functionalis are just layers of the endometrium. And in the uterine cycle, the preovulatory phase is also called the proliferative phase because the endometrium, particularly the stratum functionalis, is growing in thickness. Now, the third phase of a woman's reproductive cycle is called ovulation. And this is when the mature follicle ruptures and releases the secondary oocyte. What triggers ovulation is a surge in luteinizing hormone. So that happens if you had a 28-day cycle. That would happen at day 14. So roughly halfway in your cycle. So here in orange, in this chart here, you notice this surge of luteinizing hormone. This is going to trigger the release of the secondary oocyte. Okay, and we're also going to start to see a little bit of positive feedback here because in addition to your luteinizing hormone levels being high, estrogen levels are high, and it's going to kind of feed back and keep these levels high enough so ovulation will occur. Now the post-ovulatory phase, this is roughly the last 14 days of the cycle. And in the ovary, what you get is the formation of the corpus luteum under the influence of luteinizing hormone. And remember, the corpus luteum secretes progesterone, estrogen, relaxin, and inhibin. This is also called the luteal phase after the corpus luteum. Now, We're still in the ovarian cycle. We're still in the ovaries. So if the oocyte is not fertilized, the corpus luteum typically lasts 2 weeks. And then it'll become the corpus albicans. Albicans is referring to, becomes white. And then because the corpus luteum stops making progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin, gonadotropin levels, gonadotropin releasing hormones, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone start to rise. And soon you're going to start to see new follicular growth. If the oocyte is fertilized, the corpus luteum lasts more than 2 weeks. It lasts basically up until about the end of the first trimester of pregnancy. This is what may or may not cause a miscarriage early in the first trimester. So as long as the corpus luteum produces progesterone, then when it starts to slowly die away, it's the placenta's turn to start making progesterone. And if that's not a smooth transition, then the woman would perhaps miscarry. Also, the corpus luteum produces human chorionic gonadotropin. This is going to help fertilize or help stimulate the corpus luteum to last longer. This is also the hormone that most home pregnancy tests look for in the urine of females. Now, in the post-ovulatory phase, we also have uterine events. So we do get a thickening. The endometrium continues to thicken. It's also called the secretory phase of the uterine cycle because glandular activity at its peak. And the peak occurs about 1 week after ovulation because this is when the fertilized ovum might arrive in the uterus. Fertilization, the uniting of sperm and egg, occurs in the uterine or fallopian tubes. Once fertilization occurs, it takes another week for the fertilized ovum to arrive into the endometrium of the uterus in order to implant. So this is why the peak of the endometrium thickness occurs a week after ovulation. If fertilization does not occur, levels of progesterone and estrogens decline, okay, and then that will lead back to menstruation, and the cycle repeats itself. Now, I realize this looks like a really complicated drawing, but I really like it because, okay, let me get my cursor. Here we go. Because it shows you, kind of correlates what's going on with your hypothalamus and your pituitary gland, and that coordinates with the ovarian and the uterine cycle. So we can see, if we look, we're just going to look at the ovarian and uterine cycle. We can see as menstruation occurs, so during the period, if you will, the follicles are starting to develop in the uterine, or I'm sorry, in the ovary. As one becomes dominant, notice one follicle becomes dominant in the ovary, then we'll see the change in the uterine tissue, particularly the stratum functionalis in the lighter pink starts to thicken. Again, it's still growing, and then notice, going back to the ovary, ovulation occurs, okay, and post post-ovulatory, in the post-ovulatory cycle, let's say it this way, about 1 more week, the endometrium continues to thicken in the uterus, and hopefully in hopes of a fertilized egg implanting. And I believe, so it's quite an amazing thing. So I believe that is the end of my lecture. Thanks very much.